You know that feeling when you want to really get something complex? Like, understand the nuts and bolts without drowning in jargon.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, that's what we try to do here. And today, we're diving into a huge shift that's happening, the electric vehicle revolution, you could call it, in China.
Absolutely. And you've gathered some great material for us to dig into.
Right. You're in luck. We've sifted through the key reports and articles to pull out the really crucial stuff.
And one piece in particular, focusing on China's IT sector, gives a really interesting angle on the EV transition. It helps understand the successes, sure, but also some of the roadblocks they've hit.
Okay, so mission for today, unpack this whole China EV situation. Where does it stand? What's pushing it? What's holding it back?
Exactly.
Think of this as your shortcut, to getting seriously informed on this without feeling like you need a PhD in policy.
Let's jump in. Where do we start? The big picture.
Yeah, let's get the scale first.
Yeah.
How big was China in the EV game early on?
Well, they were massive, really. If you look back at, say, 2018, the IEA, that's the International Energy Agency, they reported China had something like 2.31 million electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids combined.
2.31 million. How did that compare globally?
Way ahead. Europe had about 1.24 million back then, and the US was around 1.12 million. So China was clearly leading the pack, no question.
Okay, hold on. Let's just quickly define those terms so we're all on the same page. EV, PHEV. What's the difference again? And what about regular hybrids?
Right, good point. So EV, battery electric vehicle, runs only on electricity. You plug it in to charge. Simple enough.
Got it.
Then PHEV, plug-in hybrid. It also has a battery you can plug in, so it can run mostly on electricity. But crucially, it also has a gasoline engine for backup, longer trips, that kind of thing.
Okay, plug-in plus gas backup.
Exactly. And then HEVs, the regular hybrids, they mostly use the gas engine, but have an electric motor that helps out, at lower speeds. Big difference is you can't plug them in. The battery gets charged by the gas engine itself.
Right, no plugging in.
And in China, when they talk about new energy vehicles or NEVs, they've traditionally meant just the EVs and PHEVs, although recently there's been talk about maybe including HEVs too.
Interesting. Okay, so mainly EVs and PHEVs. Now, China set some huge goals for these, didn't they? I remember hearing some pretty wild numbers.
Oh, yeah. Ambitious is putting it mildly. Their target for 2020 was 5 million EVs on the road. 5 million.
Wow. How did that compare to other countries?
Well, France was aiming for 2 million. California and the UK were looking at 1.5 million. Germany and Japan around 1 million each. So China's target was way bigger.
And wasn't there an even bigger target further out?
Yep. The 2030 target was, frankly, staggering. 80 million EVs.
80 million. Good grief.
It was all laid out in their energy saving and new energy vehicle industry development plan from 2012 to 2020. That plan also aimed for 2 million EV sales in 2020, which would get them towards that 5 million total on the road.
So the big question then, were they hitting these massive targets? How was the progress?
Well, things looked really good for a while. Up until 2018, they seemed pretty much on track. But then 2019 happened.
Ah, okay. What changed?
It was the first time ever that year-over-year sales actually decreased. The China Association of Automobile Manufacturers, CAM, reported about 1.2 million new energy vehicles sold in 2019. That was down from over 1.25 million in 2018.
So a drop. And was it much lower than they expected for 2019?
Yeah, significantly. Their revised forecast for 2019 was 1.5 million sales. So 1.2 million was quite a bit short. That strong growth just stalled.
That's a real turnaround. What was their initial game plan for rolling out all these EVs? Were they focusing on personal cars from the start?
Not exactly. The strategy was more focused on commercial vehicles first. Things like buses, taxis, government fleets, company cars.
Okay, vehicles with predictable routes and usage.
Precisely. The idea was that this sector would lead the way, be the early adopters, and then personal car demand would sort of follow, growing more naturally.
But that didn't quite happen in 2019.
No, demand from the corporate side actually fell more than expected. And the really key thing, growth in personal EV sales just didn't pick up the slack. It didn't grow enough.
Right, so the core problem became getting regular consumers, everyday people, to buy EVs.
That seems to be the heart of it, yeah. The lack of really strong growth and personal adoption.
Okay, so why weren't people buying them in bigger numbers? Were there government policies trying to push this? I assume there were incentives.
Oh, absolutely. There were several key policies. One big one was the NEV credit policy.
NEV credit policy? How did that work?
Basically, it said that car manufacturers making a certain number of regular cars also had to make sure a certain percentage of their production or sales were these new energy vehicles.
A quota, essentially.
Yeah, pretty much. It started at 10% in 2019 and was set to go up to 12% in 2020, then 14% in 2021.
And what happened if a company didn't meet its quota?
They had to buy credits from companies that did meet their targets or even exceeded them. Think of it like a cap and trade system, but for EVs.
Okay, that sounds like it should force companies to make and sell EVs, right? So why didn't it boost personal sales enough?
Well, here's the interesting part. It kind of backfired in a way. The system ended up creating a seller's market for these credits.
How so?
It turned out that a lot of companies, maybe 2/3 of them, were actually meeting their targets anyway.
Okay.
So there were plenty of credits available to buy, which kept the price of those credits pretty low.
Ah, I see. So if you were a company making mostly gasoline cars, you could just buy cheap credits instead of really pushing hard to sell EVs.
Exactly. It took the pressure off. It gave them an easier, maybe cheaper way out than investing heavily in promoting and selling EVs to consumers who might have been hesitant.
Okay, that makes sense. What about those license plate restrictions? I heard that in big cities like Beijing or Shanghai, getting plates for a gas car is really hard, but easy for an EV. Wasn't that a big incentive?
It definitely was intended to be a big incentive, yeah. In cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Hangzhou, Guiyang, they really limited the number of new gasoline car plates. You had to enter lotteries or auctions, often very expensive.
Right.
But for new energy vehicles, you could get these green license plates much more easily. Plus, they often came with perks, like parking discounts or being allowed in certain lanes.
That sounds like a strong reason to choose an EV if you live in one of those cities.
For sure, in those specific urban centers, it was a factor. But it clearly wasn't enough on its own to drive massive nationwide personal adoption, especially when other things changed.
Like what else changed around 2019?
The other huge factor was purchase subsidies.
The money.
Exactly. Before, both the national government and local governments offered pretty substantial subsidies, direct cash, basically, to people buying EVs.
Making them cheaper to buy up front.
Right. But those subsidies were gradually phased out. And by 2019, they were pretty much gone, except maybe for some really high-end, expensive models.
So EVs suddenly became a lot more expensive for the average buyer.
Essentially, yes. The price gap between an EV and a comparable gasoline car widened considerably for many people, and it's widely thought that removing those subsidies was a major reason personal EV adoption slowed down so much in 2019.
Price is always huge. But the article you mentioned also brought up something more fundamental about whether EVs are actually suitable for personal use day to day. It mentioned some pretty strong language.
It did, yeah. Some voices in the Chinese auto media were apparently quite harsh, even calling EVs large garbage, which is, extreme.
Wow, why such a strong reaction?
The core argument seems to be about convenience. The whole process of needing to charge, planning around charging, it just isn't as spontaneous or easy as pulling into a gas station for 5 minutes. Taking a long trip on a whim, much harder in an EV, they argued.
Right, the classic range anxiety, but also just the time involved in charging. That really came through in the piece.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about the time, but the reliability of the range. You see these advertised ranges, maybe over 500 kilometers for some fancy models.
Yeah, those sound great on paper.
But many more common ones are maybe around 300 kilometers. Again, that's the catalog figure. The problem is the actual real-world range you get can be a lot less.
Why is that? What makes the range drop?
Several things. Batteries naturally degrade over time, just like your phone battery. Fast charging can speed that up. Temperature is a big one. Cold weather really hurts range. And just how you drive, accelerating hard, high speeds, it all uses more juice.
And the article gave some specific examples of this, right? Especially on highways or in the cold.
Yes, it really highlighted concerns about range dropping significantly in the cold, partly because the battery chemistry isn't as efficient, and partly because you're using energy to heat the car.
Makes sense.
And highway driving, too. High speeds just eat through the battery much faster. They mentioned one test by a media outlet on a luxury EV, the NIO ES8, claimed range was 512 kilometers.
Okay, pretty decent.
But in their highway test, driving at 120 kilometers per hour, it only managed 242 kilometers.
What? Less than half.
Yeah, more than half the range just gone. at highway speed. That's a huge difference.
That would definitely make you anxious on a long drive. And does the charging infrastructure help ease that anxiety?
Yeah.
What's the situation with chargers on highways?
Well, the official guideline is to have chargers at least every other service area on highways. That works out to roughly every 200 kilometers or so.
Okay, 200 kilometers. But if your real range is dipping towards that or even below.
Exactly. You can see how drivers could easily get stranded. The article mentioned that EVs running out of battery on highways is becoming more common, apparently, and even causing traffic jams during busy times.
Yikes. Okay, so highway charging can be dicey. What about in cities? Is it better there? You'd think with more EVs, they'd have lots of charger.
They are installing more chargers in cities, definitely. But user satisfaction seems, well, not great, according to the piece. There are a couple of common frustrations.
Like what?
One big one is just finding a spot. Regular gasoline cars often park in the EV charging spots because parking is tight overall, so you finally find a charger and you can't even get to it.
Oh, that would be infuriating.
Oh,
ICEing, they call it, right? Internal combustion engine blocking the spot.
right. And then even if you get the spot, the charger itself might be broken. Apparently, malfunctions are common and repairs can be slow. Sometimes they just put an out-of-order sign up and leave it.
So unreliable chargers plus blocked spots. Not a great user experience.
Not ideal, no. And it sounds like the companies actually running these charging stations are struggling too.
How so? Not making money.
It seems that way. Many apparently thought it would be easy, install chargers, collect fees, but usage hasn't always been as high as expected. Plus, they have ongoing costs for maintenance, repairs, and dealing with things like those gasoline cars blocking spots. Some have even shut down.
Okay, so the whole personal EV shift hit some serious practical bumps related to range, charging, and just the overall convenience compared to gas cars.
That seems to be a fair summary of the challenges, yeah.
The material also highlighted some really cool success stories, right? These alternative models, Hangzhou and Liuzhou.
Yes, absolutely. These show different ways things can work. Let's talk about Hangzhou first. They focused on their taxi fleet.
Okay, taxis, what do they do?
Since way back in 2011, they've been transitioning their taxis to electric. Now, something like 40% of their taxi fleet is EV, and they're still expanding it.
40% is pretty significant. How did they overcome the charging problem for taxis that need to be running constantly?
Ah, that's the key innovation in Hangzhou. They didn't rely on plugging in, they went big on battery swapping.
Battery swapping, you mean like taking the battery out and putting a fresh one in?
Exactly that. A taxi driver pulls into a swapping station, a robotic system takes out the depleted battery, slots in a fully charged one, and boom.
How long does that take?
As little as 3 minutes, apparently.
3 minutes. That's
Yeah,
like filling up
yep.
with gas.
Pretty much. It completely gets rid of that long downtime for charging. You can see why taxi drivers would love it, right? No losing hours during a shift waiting for a charge.
Absolutely. Massive difference for their productivity.
And what's really interesting is how this model seems to create a better business case, too, compared to just charging stations.
Also,
These swapping stations, often built into existing gas stations, don't just make money from the swaps. They can offer other services, car washes, tire changes, maybe quick repairs, snacks for the drivers. It becomes more of a service hub.
multiple revenue streams. Makes sense.
Right.
Did the article mention if these stations are actually profitable?
It did cite an analysis by BU. They figured a swapping station, even a fairly small one, could break even with about 46 swaps per day.
Okay. Is that achievable?
Well, it mentioned Beijing has deployed thousands of battery swapping EVs and has about 100 stations. They're apparently averaging around 40 swaps per station per day already.
Wow, so they're really close to profitability potentially.
Seems like it. And as more EV taxis hit the road, that number should go up. So the battery swapping model looks quite promising, especially for fleets like taxis.
That's fascinating. A completely different approach driven by the specific need. But you mentioned a challenge.
Yeah, the main hurdle is the initial investment. Setting up these swapping stations is expensive, and the EVs themselves need to be compatible with the swapping system. So local government subsidies and support seem pretty crucial to get it off the ground.
Got it. High upfront cost, but potentially very effective for certain uses.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's Hangzhou. What about the other success story, Liuzhou? That was about personal cars, right?
Yes, Liuzhou is a totally different angle, focused on personal transport in a more, let's say, typical regional city.
Hmm.
Population around 3.9 million, mostly relies on buses for public transit.
And what was so special about Liuzhou's EV adoption?
Their numbers are really impressive. By the end of 2018, they had a new energy vehicle ownership rate of 5.4%,
5.4%. How does that compare?
much higher than the national average, which was just over 1% then, and even higher than Beijing, which was around 3.7%.
Wow. You said Liuzhou didn't have those license plate restrictions?
Exactly. No restrictions, which means people were choosing these NEVs willingly. It wasn't forced by lottery pay.
So what was the secret in Liuzhou? How did they make EVs so appealing to regular folks?
Their success seems to come down to focusing on a very specific type of vehicle. Microvehicle.
Like vehicles, like small cars.
Tiny cars, really small, two-door, two-seaters, even smaller than the Japanese kei cars. Apparently, you can fit two of them in one standard parking space.
Two in one spot. Okay, that's small. Were they expensive?
No, that was another key part. They were very affordable, priced around 50,000 yuan, which is roughly maybe 780,000 yen, or under $8,000 USD.
Tiny and cheap. Okay, I can see the appeal for city driving. What else made them popular?
The killer app, it seems, was letting these micro vehicles use the bus lanes.
In a city relying heavily on buses, that's a huge perk, isn't it?
Massive. It made them super attractive for commuting, perfect for one or two people, cheap to run, and you get to zip past traffic in the bus lane. A big time saver.
That's smart. Any other support for them?
Yeah, they also apparently created dedicated parking spots for these micro vehicles, often with charging available. They managed to get a really good ratio of chargers to vehicles.
So Liuzhou basically tailored the vehicle and the rules perfectly to their local situation and commuting needs.
It really looks that way. It's a great example of stimulating personal EV demand by offering something that genuinely fits people's lives and makes things easier, not harder.
Okay, so pulling this all together, it seems like the big lesson is that just swapping gas cars for electric ones isn't the whole story. You have to think about how people use them.
Exactly. A one-size-fits-all approach clearly has limitations. Trying to just replicate gasoline car usage patterns with early EVs led to frustration with range and charging.
But we saw 3 successful patterns emerge from the materials.
Right. First, there's the planned, predictable use case buses, commercial fleets, where charging or swapping can be scheduled.
Then Hangzhou, using clever tech like battery swapping to make the EV experience almost as convenient as gas, especially for high-use vehicles like taxis.
Yep. And third, Liuzhou, where the users adapted, embracing smaller, more specialized EVs that perfectly suited their specific urban commuting needs, helped along by smart infrastructure and rules like bus lane access.
So it sounds like even though China's EV push hit that bump in 2019, they're still way out front globally. And they're learning incredibly valuable lessons both from what didn't work and what did.
Absolutely. They are arguably the world's most advanced EV market, warts and all. And the global trend is definitely towards EVs, so studying China's journey, the successes and the failures, is crucial for other countries, Japan included, as they figure out their own transitions.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive today, we saw China's huge initial EV lead, then the slowdown in personal buying linked to things like subsidy cuts and real-world charging hassles.
But also, those really creative solutions. Hangzhou's battery swap taxi solving the downtime issue,
Yep.
and Liuzhou's popular little microcars perfectly fitting a niche.
Hopefully digging into this has given you a clearer, more nuanced picture of what's a really complex and fact-moving situation.
Definitely. And it leaves us with a really interesting thought to chew on, doesn't it? When you look at Hangzhou's tech-heavy solution versus Liuzhou's focus on the right type of vehicle and user adaptation, what do you think is ultimately the most critical factor for making the EV transition work in different places? Is it purely the technology getting better? Is it all about building out charging or swapping infrastructure? Or is it more about changing how people think about cars, their driving habits? Or maybe it's the government policies pulling the right levers.
Technology, infrastructure, user behavior, policy, or some mix of all 4.
Exactly. Something for you to ponder as we all watch this electric future unfold.